Does God have an ideal form of government? What about a democracy? What about a king? What's the ideal? Well, we live in a day when man is aggressively trying to redefine the definition of marriage. Sex outside of marriage is celebrated, sadly. Divorce has been accepted as the norm, and man is even pushed to legalize same-sex marriage. I would say that God tolerates a lot. But what is God's ideal for marriage? Well, we know. In fact, Jesus, when asked in Matthew chapter 19, said, "Have you not read that he that made them in the beginning created them male and female? And said, for this cause should a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they twain should become one flesh. What man is joined together, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder." Now again, God's patience has put up with a lot, but don't confuse what God's long-suffering tolerates with what his will, his intent, and his ideal is. So how do we know what God's will is? Well, we look at what God did when given the opportunity to begin with. It's called, biblically, the law of first mention. We see marriage given in Genesis 1 through 3. Well, we know that God established the realm of civil government. But is there one type that's more in line with God's design or God's intent? To that, I would suggest that we examine the original form of government that God established. Now, when we think of Israel, it's likely that our original conception is wrong. We think of kings, we think of a monarchy. And it is true that God is to be king, king of Israel and king of all the world. But the nation of Israel was not a monarchy. It was a commonwealth of 12 sovereign, self-governing, what I would say, states. The Bible uses the term tribes. I would say states because they actually had geographical boundaries. They had a common worldview operating under a common constitution, that being the Torah, which was their law. Now, as I mentioned in the last session, we often think of the law or the Torah purely in a spiritual aspect. However, the law consisted of 3 sections. There was the law, which included God's morality. This transcends time. Do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. But you will also find what are identified as the statutes for worship. This was God's ceremonial system of sacrifice. This was the Aaronic priesthood. This system pointed to the Lamb of God. The animal sacrifices were insufficient to pay for the sins, but done in faith, looking forward to the sacrifice which was sufficient to take away the sins of the world, that being Jesus. Ladies and gentlemen, no one, whether it be Abel, all the way up to the last person who dies rejecting the mark of the beast in the tribulation period, no one gets into heaven other than through the blood of Christ. But the sacrificial system was put in place as a type of the sacrifice of Jesus. And of course, all of that was finished. Jesus fulfilled that. The veil in the temple was rent in twain from top to bottom when Jesus was crucified. So that part of the law was fulfilled. But then there was a section called the judgments. This was the civil law for the well-being of Israel. Within the comprehensive nature of the law, there were policies that dealt with basic banking and business, fair weights and measures, fair trade, debt, bankruptcy. A person was limited to the amount of debt he could assume. You had the ability to mortgage up to 6 years of the value of your labor, or you could mortgage your land, but you couldn't sell it. It stayed in the family. You could mortgage it for up to 50 years in a land lease. Then it would be returned to your heirs. They were taught as people to be productive, to be prepared to lend, but they weren't to be borrowers because the borrower became enslaved to the lender. If you were caught cheating in business, you paid it back with a penalty. If you stole something, you didn't go to jail. You paid it back fourfold or you worked off the value. There were rules for sanitary safety, whether it be a latrine outside the camp or the proper washing of hands or dishes or putting sick people into quarantine. By the way, you don't put healthy people into quarantine, Dr. Fauci, you moron. That's called jail is what it is. Why? Why? Well, God's concerned with the health and well-being of his people. There were rules so they would not be overworked. In fact, they were required by law to rest on certain days. Both the employee and the employer and the animals alike were even commanded to rest. You talk about an act of mercy when you consider the world in which that law was given. There were rules that pertained to taking care of the poor. They weren't handouts, but charity was accomplished through the poor working the fields and gleaning what was left in the fields so they could with dignity work for and provide for their own families. You had rules that pertained to morality in the family. You had rules that pertained to military service. Legally, no man was found guilty without a fair trial, and guilt could only be established in the mouths of at least 2 or 3 witnesses. Very similar to what I'd shown you on the first night. Again, this morning, they too had 4 realms of government, much like ours, but instead, where we have the church age, they had the priesthood that was responsible for the area of mercy and ministry and taking care of those that had special need. But Israel was not ruled by a king or by a giant central government. During a major crisis, God raised up rulers for whom the people consented, i.e. a Moses to lead them out of bondage and out of tyranny, a Joshua, General Joshua, to lead them out of oppression and into the land of Canaan, somewhat like when the colonies called a certain judge by the name of George Washington to lead the Continental Army. They were a commonwealth of 12 tribes or states governed by one rule of law. There was no need for major taxes as there was no standing central government. There was no standing army. There was a militia that was made up of every able-bodied man across the 12 tribes. They trusted in God. How do you trust in God? By obeying him, by doing it the way he told you to do it. They chose out from among themselves capable men that feared God, loved truth, and hated covetousness. They were to judge righteously in all matters among all people according to the law. There was to be no favoritism anywhere. There was an assembly of elders that represented the tribes themselves in national assemblies, and elders that judged at the local level in the gates of the city. They were to be judges over tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. There was to be no favoritism to the poor or to the rich. Bribery was expressly forbidden. The goal was righteousness for the people. And let me also inject this. You see much confusion when you read like the King James Bible and talks about servants or slavery. You can enslave yourself in debt. You can enslave yourself up to 7 years, the value of your labor. You could mortgage your family property up to 50 years, the value of that property. It could be redeemed earlier if you had a capable and willing kinsman redeemer, a near kinsman that could fulfill the obligations and pay off your debt, in other words. But there was no such thing as bankruptcy. You worked off your debt. You didn't just default on it. But the law specifically says a person who steals another man's labor, a person who steals a man and puts him into slavery, well, guess what the Bible says? That's a capital offense, and that man is to be put to death. So, no, the Bible does not condone slavery as we like to define slavery from the 1860s or the early 1800s. That was not a biblical precept. Unfortunately, in 1 Samuel, as Samuel was near his death, the Philistines were literally an imminent threat to their security, and rather than trusting in God and obeying his instructions as I've just spelled out for you and following the law, There was no security. There was no safety or order, as every man did what was right in his own eyes. Basically, there was anarchy. And as Benjamin Franklin says, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become more corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. As President John Adams said, our Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Understand that chart I showed you yesterday. Self-government, family government, church government, civil government. If you got strong self-government, moral people, you got strong families, you got strong churches, well, you can have a very limited civil government because you've got moral, courteous, gracious, law-abiding people that are governed from within. You don't need a police officer on every corner making sure you're doing things the right way. Well, sadly, the Jews cried out saying, we need a strong arm of central government to take care of us when we have needs and to be able to provide for us and to protect us from the Philistines. God tried to talk them out of it. In fact, Samuel felt like he'd failed. He said, God, they're rejecting me. God said, no, Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. They're not trusting me. I said, do it this way, but they refuse to do it my way. They want to do it their own way. Okay, we'll let them. They're not going to like it. They're not going to like what's going to happen. King's going to take their sons and turn them into soldiers. King's going to take their money. He's going to take their property. They're not going to like it. But if they want to be just like every other country, let them have it. And with that, we saw the transition to Saul. But the point I want to make is the foundation, what God actually established for Israel, that they actually operated under for 400 years, was 12 states ruled by the Constitution, i.e. the Torah, the law, and they were to be overseen by people, capable people that were chosen out from among them, that feared God and loved truth and hated covetousness. That is a very similar system, if you think about it, to what our founding fathers followed when we began. Woodrow Wilson was one of the worst presidents in American history. In fact, maybe Joe Biden is the only one that's worse. But when he was a university professor, he actually made this statement. Of course, he was one of the guys that really wanted to push. He was a progressive, big-time progressive. Well, how do you change America? How do you change the people? And he wrote an article that was published in Political Science Quarterly back in 1787. And I'll just summarize it for you. It's actually on the screen, the segment that I'm referencing. But he said, basically, what one generation would resist but eventually accept, their children would accept it because their parents did. And then every following generation would accept it because, well, it's always been that way. That's what we're operating under currently in America. We are nowhere close to even pretending to follow the Declaration or the Constitution. Early in America, we had freedom. We had British citizens came to the New World and they were free men. They could elect their own legislatures, make their own laws. They could tax themselves as they deemed necessary. They could own property, buy, sell, trade with whomever they chose to trade with. Most importantly, as we've mentioned several times, they were free to study the Bible and worship the Lord in spirit and in truth without having to serve at the whim of the Church of England. And of course, their civil liberty was violated. Their charters, or their colonial constitutions between England and Massachusetts, between England and Virginia, the king simply broke them. He said, I know that's what we agreed to, but I'm the king. Doesn't apply to me. Legislatures. Yeah, I know the charter says you can have your own elected legislature, but yeah, we're doing away with that. I'm the king. In fact, I'm going to appoint an imperial dictator for Massachusetts. Taxes were levied without representation. Understand this, the tea tax was not high. As a matter of fact, if the colonists in Boston had wanted to go ahead and receive that tea that had been delivered, it would have been cheaper than what they could have bought it elsewhere. But it was the principle that offended them. If somebody else, without your consent, can impose a tax on you legally and get into your wallet, which, by the way, when somebody gets into your wallet without your permission, we call that theft. But if we acknowledge and allow the principle of legalized theft okay, king, we'll let you tax us without our consent, then they would have become, literally, they said in their own writing, we become slaves. Because if I can just come right now, if I could just force every one of you to give me $1 right now, and that's legal, you have no say-so in it, well, then why can't I have you give me $10 right now? As a matter of fact, give me $100 right now. Matter of fact, every one of you, just give me your car keys right now. So this was slavery. And that's why they refused to accept that tea in Boston Harbor. Standing armies were housed in the colonies, even though we weren't at war with anybody. Armies were here to make sure that the British subjects were not causing any problems. There was no more trial by jury of peers. You had to go all the way to England. Nobody could afford to do that if you had a disagreement. And then, of course, this issue, which no one has taught about, they were about to lose their religious liberty as well because the king intended to reestablish the control, and that's what it was, the control of the bishops of the Anglican Church over all the colonies. Well, as you learned last night, if not for the pastors, they were the most educated men. They were bold men. They knew what this was leading to. In fact, they were only a couple of hundred years out of the Dark Ages, so they knew what this was leading to. They were the sons of Issachar that stood up and cried out for liberty in their pulpits and led for liberty. And because of the pastors, we declared our independence. As a matter of fact, this was submitted as a suggestion for our United States seal. Of course, you all know our seal. We've got the eagle with his wings spread and the shield and the arrows. But this actually was suggested by supposedly our least religious founding fathers. This was suggested by Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. And you notice here, you've got the Egyptian army drowning in the Red Sea. You got Moses and the Israelites on the seashore. You got the Shekinah, the pillar of fire and pillar of a cloud. And around the outside, it says, rebellion to tyranny is obedience to God. As a matter of fact, after they came together to officially sign the Declaration of Independence, this was a couple of months after July, they had the thing all drafted up, looked pretty. Most of the men came back for the official announcement. Of course, it had already been enforced since July the 4th. Sam Adams, as he was so inclined to do, gave a speech. He said, we have this day restored the sovereign to whom all men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven from the rising to the setting of the sun. Let his kingdom come. Now let's look at the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence transcends time. The Declaration of Independence is a spiritual document. One thing this thing does, it gives our mission statement. To assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them. It gives our statement of faith. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And it gives the purpose of government, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the main purpose of governments is not to build airports or even streets or even put in a septic system or in your neighborhood. The primary purpose of government is to secure your unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You may forfeit your life if you commit some crime, but your life you cannot just be deprived of your life by a government, by an individual. You might forfeit your liberty by committing some crime, but you couldn't have your liberty just taken from you by some government or individual. And the pursuit of happiness, if you checked out Blackstone, that doesn't mean any lascivious thing that comes to your mind. Blackstone defined happiness as every man having his vine, every man having his fig tree, every man being able to have his family, have his business, have his home, and enjoy the blessings of liberty that God intended for a man to have. That's what the pursuit of happiness meant. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, we're going to come back to that later on in the session. What's this say? Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it's the right of the people to alter it, to abolish it, and to establish new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And that's exactly what they were doing with this document. And then, of course, For the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. With the signing of that document, we went from 13 colonies to 13 nations. And each nation had its own constitution. And in every one of the 13 nations, you couldn't serve in public office unless you were a professing Christian. Here's one example. I'll just give you one because we don't have time. This is from the Constitution of Delaware, Article 22. Every person who should be chosen a member of either house or appointed to any office or place of trust before taking his seat or entering upon the execution of his office shall make and subscribe the following declaration. I state your name. Do profess faith in God the Father and in Jesus Christ his only Son and in the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore. And I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. Wow. In order to be trusted to serve in public office, the people had to know that those serving had to know that when no one was watching, someone was watching. They were always going to be accountable to God. That's why that was so important. You can join most churches in America today easier than you could serve in public office in any of the colonies. Well, of course, we know that King George didn't take that declaration very well, and we actually had to fight a war to secure it. Doesn't always happen. Great Britain exited the European Union back in 2015. No war fought, but they are now free and not part of the EU. Catalonia seceded from Spain. No war fought, but we know they're successfully seceded. Quite frankly, we're not told this in America, but Crimea, which was largely Russian, seceded from Ukraine. They had a legal vote that they wanted to be affiliated with the Russian Federation. And we're not taught that over here. We're taught, oh, something terrible happened. No, they seceded from the Ukraine. There was no war fought over it. It was just a peaceful deal. We have the right of assembly. We either have the right of assembly or we don't have the right of assembly. Well, of course, they had to fight for their freedom and eventually won it. But understand this, we had 13 states that had a common foe. In fact, they needed to work together for their common defense. So the first Constitution in the United States is actually a document that was not even officially signed until 1781. We were 5 years into the war. We were kind of operating under its guidelines, but it wasn't actually signed and ratified until 1781. It's called the Articles of Confederation, and it formed a perpetual union. That didn't mean that it never ended. That just means that there wasn't a sunset clause. It means, hey, from now we're going to continue to work together to provide for our common defense and for our general welfare and to secure our liberties together, but each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. So even though they were called the United States of America, they were free states that worked together for their common defense and for their general welfare. But what took place in Pennsylvania was Pennsylvania business. What took place in Massachusetts was Massachusetts business. But they worked together for their common defense. At that time, it was Great Britain, an invading army, and for their general welfare and well-being. That was the original design. Now, when we won this war miraculously, the Treaty of Paris, notice a couple things. One, these weren't atheists and deists. They called God to witness this in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Atheists and deists would not be putting that statement on this document. Article 1, this peace agreement was between Great Britain and the United States vis-a-vis New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and these are free, sovereign, and independent states, even referring to them as them. So what's the point? 13 sovereign states. Massachusetts is Massachusetts, North Carolina is North Carolina. They work together for their common defense and general welfare as the United States. But they were free, sovereign, independent states. Now, there were some issues. They had problems, obviously. There's always problems in government. And by the way, man is very good about getting on his face and seeking God's intervention when times are tough. And then when it's not so tough, we say, God, you can take the day off. We've got it under our control. we're that way. We know the Israelites are that way, as recorded in the book of Judges, and we know that our founding fathers were that way. You know, when King George had the power, government was evil. Well, now that we've got the power, well, government can be trusted. Government can be good. As a matter of fact, we need bigger government. That's what the debates were at the Constitutional Convention. 1786, they came together. They originally tried to gather in 1786, but not enough states showed up because they were suspicious of creating a general government that could become too strong and grow out of control. But finally, General Washington got involved, and in 1787, 12 of the 13 states gathered with the instruction to amend, not to replace, the Articles of Confederation. They were supposed to take their existing constitution and not destroy them and start all over again. They were supposed to tighten them up and make them a little stronger than what they currently were. Rhode Island did not even attend. Rhode Island, in fact, according to the Articles of Confederation, nothing they did was legal, because under the Articles of Confederation, it had to be unanimous. Rhode Island didn't even show up because they didn't trust what was going on. Always leave it up to the Baptists to be the troublemakers in any kind of meeting. Like I said a while ago, Baptists are like Jews. When you got two of them in the room, you'll get three different opinions. So, in fact, the man that was the hero of the War for Independence, Patrick Henry from Virginia, he was voted to be a delegate representing Virginia, and Patrick Henry refused to go, famously saying, "I smell a rat." So I'm not making any statements other than this. This was not a kumbaya prayer meeting that the entire country was agreed to, like the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was overseas as one of the representatives in France. Patrick Henry didn't even show. This was political wrangling. Just like the Republican convention or something going on in Congress. This was not, let's hold hand and sing hymns and have a prayer meeting. This was good old-fashioned political angling and wrangling. But at the end of the day, here's what they came up with. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, we need to improve the one we're working under. We've already been working together since 1776. It's now 1787. By the time we get this ratified, it'll be 1789. In order to improve what we're currently working under, they designed a limited general government. Understand, the Declaration of Independence, as I showed you a while ago, it's our birth certificate. It's our statement of faith. It's our mission statement. It's very spiritual. It transcends time. The Constitution is nothing spiritual. The Constitution is the nuts and bolts. It's like the owner's manual in your car. This is like the operating agreement. All right, what's this general government going to look like? Well, Article 1, the most important thing we're going to do is we're going to have a legislature. Well, how are we going to do that? By state or by the people? Well, we'll do both. That'll be fair. So you have the House of Representatives, which is done per capita, by population. So Texas, how many representatives does Texas have? You all know? You got a lot more. Oklahoma, we've got 5 United States representatives. Now, we've got better football teams in Oklahoma than you all do down here. We got 5. You have a lot more representatives because your population is 28, 29 million. Our population is 4 million. So we have 5 U.S. representatives. You've got a lot more than that. So representatives are by state representing the people by population. By the way, all spending bills must begin in the House. Why is that? Because the state has no money. The only money they have are in our pockets. The only money the state can spend, supposedly, before they just flipped on the printing press here in the last couple of years and just printing it like a party, looks like a victory parade after the Super Bowl downtown somewhere with all the paper they're printing these days. But spending bills must begin in the House because it's the people's money. The only money the state has to spend is what they take from us in taxes or what they borrow and we're obligated to repay. So when somebody says, oh, those are state funds, the state doesn't have any funds. It's the people's money, which is why spending bills must begin in the House. Then you've got the Senate. The Senate, up until 1913, was appointed by state legislatures. So you wouldn't vote for Ted Cruz. your legislature would appoint Ted Cruz, and then Ted would be accountable and answer to your legislature. And if he wasn't doing the job they wanted him to do, they'd yank his butt back and put somebody else in office. That's how it worked, because the Senate was to represent the states. Well, Oklahoma's got 4 million people. Texas has 28 million, 29 million people. But you have 2 senators and we have 2 senators, because we're a state and you're a state. So by population, you've got a little larger vote, but by state, we're equal. States are on equal ground. So both the people and the states are represented. By the way, you heard there's 3, most people make this mistake. It's just careless. We do not have 3 co-equal branches. The only branch that can make law is this one. President can't make law. Supreme Court can't make law. Now, we pretend like they do, because remember what I said a while ago about Woodrow Wilson? What one generation accepts, the next generation accepts because the parents did, and everybody else thinks that's just the way it's supposed to be done. We're operating on that's the way it's supposed to be done, isn't it? No, it's not supposed to be done. All right? Next, Article 2. You have the definition of the president and vice president and their roles to play. Did you know that our founding era presidents, George Washington, John Adams only served 1 term, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. 36 years, our founding era presidents issued a total of 15 executive orders and 10 vetoes over 36 years. You know why? They didn't believe they were to be king. They didn't believe they were to rule over the Congress. They were to carry out the will of the people as conducted through the Congress. 15 executive orders. This pinhead did more than that on day 1 when he came into office. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not how it's supposed to function, but it's how we're operating today. That's how one man in a stolen election can ruin a country. Constitution, he shouldn't have the ability to destroy us the way he's doing, but he is. Finally, Article 3, judicial. You know what? Supreme Court used to meet in the basement of the United States Capitol. They were the least important. As a matter of fact, judicial power shall extend to all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, consuls, to all cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction, to controversies between the United States and other parties, to controversies between states and between citizens between states. So really, the Supreme Court only had authority, something that took place at sea or between 2 states or between a citizen in one state and a citizen in another state. Very small and limited responsibility. Nowhere in there do they have the authority to redefine marriage. Nowhere in there do they have the authority to say abortion is legal in all 50 states. Lawfully, they don't have that ability. However, remember, what one generation accepts, the next generation will accept it because their parents did, and everybody else will just think, well, isn't that the way it's supposed to be done? We're operating in isn't that the way it's supposed to be done? And no, it's not. Now, if you look on the Supreme Court website, they have given themselves, it's not in the Constitution, they have the power of judicial review, giving the court a crucial responsibility in assuring individual rights as well as maintaining a living Constitution. Bull crap on all of that. Not true. Not true. They don't have that authority anywhere, except that they gave it to themselves. I'm going to give myself Bill Gates money. I wish it was true. Oh, unfortunately. Now, there was still so much concern even after they drafted the Constitution. Now, you all know how difficult it is to amend the Constitution. You got people championing out here for a convention of states because it's difficult to amend the Constitution. There was such great concern between those men that met in Philadelphia about creating this general government because they were afraid it could get out of control. Boy, if only they could see us today, they would know they were right. But they were so afraid this thing could get out of control and become tyrannical that before any of the states would ratify it, they said, we need to amend it. Not once, but 10 times. We call that the Bill of Rights. Congress can't do this. Congress can't do that. Congress can't do this. Congress can't do that. Then you get down to Numbers 9 and Numbers 10. If we haven't forgotten anything, if we haven't specifically listed it and given it to you, you can't do it. And everything else we've retained to the rights of the states and the people. You would have thought that would have been clear enough where they couldn't have messed it up. But look at where we're at today and what a mess we're in today. Now, folks, this is what we're taught, and this is what we're taught in our public schools. We're taught that Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, we all are just beggars begging Washington, D.C. for crumbs, and please give us permission to do this, Mr. President, and please throw us a few shekels so we can do this, Mr. President. And don't you love the subtlety of this, folks? Don't be fooled. Be critical thinkers. Notice all this. It's not by accident. Over the last 2 years, we've seen municipalities defunding the police. You know, the police are supposed to work for the local city. The sheriff is supposed to work and be elected by the people and work for the county. We've now defunded the police at the city level. The cities are in chaos, so who's going to ride into the rescue? Federal government's just going to create more of that make-believe fiat money, devaluing what you've got in savings, and they're going to fund the police. And oh boy, we're going to have a federal police department. We do not want the Gestapo. We do not want a federal police department. We need to get our cities back under control of our city government. But this is what we're told we are. But folks, this is what we actually are. We're states. We're sovereign states. Oklahoma is Oklahoma. Texas is Texas. Florida is Florida. And we work together and create this limited general government for our common defense and general welfare. You know, one of that general welfare is kind of convenient. Dan and Cindy and myself, we drove down yesterday, and when we got down to the Red River, we didn't have to stop and exchange Oklahoma dollars for Texas dollars. That's part of the general welfare. For our convenience, we can just go from state to state and use a common currency for our common defense and general welfare only. So remember, the difference, the Declaration of Independence is our birth certificate, our statement of faith, our mission statement. We are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, government is instituted among men. The Constitution is the owner's manual. The states designed a limited general government and delegated few powers that were specifically given by the states. Now again, as I said a moment ago, they were concerned. What happens if we create this new government, Mr. Madison? What happens if it grows out of control? Well, Mr. Madison assured them that that could not happen. I'll point you to one of his arguments in a series of debates, letters that were published in the papers to influence the states to ratify the Constitution. Federalist number 45, James Madison said this: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few, and we've written each one of them down individually. How many of you think they still think their power is few and defined? Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former, the federal government, will be exercised principally on external objects such as war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. Powers reserved to the several states and individual states will extend to all the subjects or objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of people, internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. The operation of the federal government will be most extensive and important during times of war and danger, those of the state governments in times of peace and security. In fact, Mr. Madison went on to say about 20 years later, when there was actually an infringement upon this for the first time, Mr. Madison said, in case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted to the federal government in the Constitution, then the states who created the Constitution in the first place have the right and in fact are in duty bound to interpose for the arresting of the progress of evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. So I referenced this yesterday, but let me give you an example. Based upon what I've just shown you in the Constitution, and based upon what authority they have, where did the Warren Court have the authority to outlaw the Bible and prayer from public education? They don't have that authority. But they made the command anyway. What the states should have done, just as Madison said, we thank you for your opinion, you're wrong. Just as wrong as you were with Dred Scott. So in Texas, doesn't apply. That's what courts do. Courts give opinions. Courts don't rule. Terminology matters, doesn't it? Oh, the court has handed down. Oh, they've handed down to us a ruling. Oh, please, Mr. Ford, please do it our way. Please, please, say there's only two genders, please. It's 1973, the Supreme Court unlawfully declared the murder of preborn children as legal. Now we have over 62 million. In fact, I've heard this is closer to 70 million dead babies. Wait a second. Operations of the federal government most extensive in times of war and danger. Those are states in times of peace and security. I hadn't read anywhere where they have the authority to force states to allow women to murder their children in the womb. What one generation resists but accepts, the next generation will accept it because their parents did, and then from then on out, everybody else will just think, well, that's the way it is. That's where we're living, ladies and gentlemen. What about this one? In 2015, we were clamoring for this. Unfortunately, there weren't enough churches with us. We were clamoring for our governor and the other 30-some-odd Republican governors that had state constitutions which defined marriage as one man and one woman. We said, Governor, just ignore that ruling. They don't have the authority to redefine marriage. As a matter of fact, this is one of the problems that's so dangerous about begging the court to hopefully see things the right way. This man, Justice Kennedy, in 2013, threw out the Defense of Marriage Act. That was one that was signed by Bill Clinton under pressure. Of course, Clinton was a pinhead, but signed the Defense of Marriage Act. He said it's unconstitutional. He actually was correct. He said that the common understanding was that domestic relations of husband and wife, parent and child, were matters reserved to the states. Although I liked having it there because we don't follow any of the law right anyway, at least it was some protection. Justice Kennedy said, nope, states' rights on marriage. He was right on that. But the lying hypocrite came back 2 years later and said, oh, no, it's not states' rights. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution takes precedence over those states' rights. So now we have gay marriage. So the same man took two sides of the same argument in 2 years, and by destructing both, we now have gay marriage. And from that, we now have transgender. We got men in girls' bathrooms, men competing in women's sports. I wonder why we never see women competing in men's sports. I just don't understand how that works. Let me show you just a part of the problem, and then we're going to give you the answer. We do have answers. We're not just here with bad news. We do have answers. Not easy. I'm a member of a group called the Council for National Policy. Council for National Policy is like the conservative counterpart to the Council on Foreign Relations. We meet 3 times a year. A lot of people, you know, Mr. Bott, for example, is a member of Council for National Policy. But I was at a meeting right after the Obergefell decision, or right about the Obergefell decision. It was like 5 years ago now. And in the picture, you're going to see Tony Perkins, good guy, one of our friends, Family Research Council. You're going to see Alan Sears at the time was the head of ADF. Again, good guy on our side, one of our team. And we have Todd Starnes, used to be a commentator at Fox News, Christian, on our side. I mean, these are all good guys. Listen to the question I ask them, and then listen to their answer.
Paul Blair.
As far as what can we do? 2004, the state of Oklahoma amended legally our state constitution to define marriage as one man and one woman. We did everything right constitutionally, and we had one federal appointed judge throw it out. Now, when we're dealing with a judiciary that has turned the Constitution upside down, for example, the First Amendment, which is supposed to defend our religious liberty, is what they use to take away our religious liberty. When after 138 years of no such thing as incorporation doctrine, all of a sudden in 1925 they create it and start applying it to states and municipalities where we can't put up a Christmas tree at Christmas. And when they're using the 14th Amendment, which at the time that it was ratified, homosexuality was illegal in every state, but they're using the 14th Amendment to force homosexual marriage on every state. How do we win, not when we're facing judicial activism, but when we're facing judicial insanity, where it's very clearly black, yet they're saying it's white? How do we win there?
Todd Starnes. I'd like to get a quote from the ADF, Alan Sears.
Actually, the simple answer, actually, it's your business, Paul, as pastor.
We can eat it.
First thing we need to do is pray.
They don't even understand the dilemma. It's a rigged game. There's no way you're going to win with the strategy that we're implementing. Now, you've already seen what the original Constitution said. Let me show you what the actual answer was. This was James Madison in a report to the Virginia Legislature in 1800. He said this: the Constitution of the United States was formed by the sanction of the United States, given by each in its sovereign capacity. In other words, the states were in charge. The states put together the general government with the Constitution. The states being the parties to the Constitutional Compact, then there can be no tribunal above their authority, no court, no Supreme Court above the authority of each state. So in other words, Texas is Texas, Maine is Maine, California is California. If California wants to have a 50% income tax and provide free everything, good luck with that. You're welcome to do it. But they can't make Texas do that. If Massachusetts wants to legalize baby slaughter, which under natural law they can't, but okay, that's Massachusetts. If Texas says, no, we cherish life, no abortion here, Texas can do that. Texas can say, hey, we don't want a state income tax. We don't want baby slaughter. As a matter of fact, we're going to have the prayer and Bible study in public education. Texas can be Texas. Massachusetts can be Massachusetts. California can be California. But we can still work together for our common defense against other nations and for our general welfare. That's how it was designed. No Supreme Court has the authority to decide as last resort whether the compact made them be violated. They must themselves decide in the last resort such questions as may be sufficient magnitude to require their interposition. Why? Because the courts can be just as corrupt as any other branch of government, is what he says. Therefore, it's up to the states to be the final arbiter for whether something is constitutional in that state. So when Obergefell was handed down, Texas should have said, appreciate your opinion. No, doesn't affect us one bit. When they legalized abortion in 1973, all the states that had laws against abortion should have said, no, we thank you for your opinion, but not legal in our state. And it's not up to the Supreme Court, you've already seen, to determine it. It's up to the state to determine whether something within that state actually follows the Constitution. Now you consider everything that they're doing to us right now and more so. And understand this, we thought that Osama bin Laden was a terrorist. But now realize if you go down to a school board meeting and complain about critical race theory, you're in the same category with Osama bin Laden. Folks, this central government we have in Washington right now is not our friend. Therefore, the answer is, as Jefferson said, that the individual states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government, but by a compact under the style and title of the Constitution of the United States and of amendments thereto, they constitute a general government for special purposes, delegated to that government certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government, and that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. In other words, if they pass an illegal law, then it's an illegal law, and we don't have to follow it. Now, right now, we are under soft tyranny. We're facing things that suppress the truth. We're facing misinformation, rewritten history. We're being silenced and shouted down. We're being deplatformed, threat of firing, intimidation and silence. The next step, if you give in to this phase, is hard tyranny. We cannot comply. We cannot move any farther. And Texas won't. Florida won't. If we can get a hold of our pinhead governor in Oklahoma, maybe we won't. But here's the final point. See that right there? You know what that is? Those are, no, that's actually 2 football teams that kick the crap out of Texas every year. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I just can't help myself. It's too easy. All right. You know what that thing is around? Yeah, it's called a border. Yeah. Know what that is? It's called a capital. You know why we have a border? Because we're a state. You know why we have a state capital? Because we're a state. We got one of these. It's Governor Stitt. You know why we have one? Because we're a state. In fact, we've got one of these. You know what that is? It's called a legislature. You know why we have one? Because we're a state. That's called a state constitution. Ours is a mess, but we have one anyway. And we got one of these. It's our state Supreme Court. You know why? Because we're a state. We're one of the many states that comprise the United States of America. And it's up to the states, the sovereign states, to say no when the federal government does something that's unconstitutional. That is the answer, not appealing to the Supreme Court. We'll deal with more with this afternoon. Folks, I don't know what we've done, but we got behind. I guess we started later than we thought. But anyway, or something was off. I've got a 30-minute video that I want you to see. Sure, we're okay to do it right now? Okay, we're going to go ahead. Okay, we're going to go ahead and play it. We're going to be a little bit behind going into lunch. We're going to have a shorter break. We're going to start lunch about 12:15. Somehow or other, we lost a half hour. But this is a 30-minute video, and we'll conclude after this. We'll have one more section before lunch. But take note of this incredible educational video and pay specific attention onto the forms of government and to the forms of economics series that you'll learn in this short video.
The United States of America. Born in 1776, our country is the offspring of a religious-based heritage of liberty under law. Blessed with great natural resources and a pioneer people given to industry and moral discipline, our nation grew to be strong and prosperous and developed the finest governmental system ever devised by man. America soon became known as the refuge of the world's tired, hungry, and poor. Millions left everything in the old world to start over in a land that rewarded initiative and hard work and perseverance. The many millions who didn't come here found comfort and hope in knowing that indeed there was such a bastion of freedom and opportunity, a place where dreams could become reality. Today, our nation appears wealthier and more powerful than ever. New technologies have revolutionized our daily lives. Luxuries once enjoyed only by the rich are commonplace and very affordable. Home ownership is widespread, and our people have the expectation of continued economic growth and prosperity. Yet more and more people are coming to realize that they may prosper materially only for a time because their freedoms are diminishing. The sobering reality is that America has been led far from its praiseworthy beginnings. Our people and businesses groan under a heavy burden of economic, political, and social problems, which are the result of a widespread departure from the fundamental truths that made our nation great. If the United States of America is to endure, citizens far and wide must once again come to understand, embrace, and live by timeless concepts called Americanism. What made America great and set it apart from other lands? Was it natural resources? No, other lands are equally blessed. Was it the people? No, the people who built America came from elsewhere. Was it government planning and wisdom that spurred our nation to such heights? No again. It wasn't what government did that made America great. It was what government was prevented from doing that made the difference. What set America apart from other lands was freedom for the individual. Freedom to work, to produce, to succeed, and especially to keep the fruits of one's labors. America became great precisely because the stifling effect of too much government had been prevented. However, freedom in America was not totally unrestrained. Americans overwhelmingly chose to limit their actions with moral codes such as the Ten Commandments, personal morality, and limited government. It's a combination that characterized America and made it the envy of the world. When our founding fathers decided they'd had enough of British oppression, they broke away and declared independence. They stated as self-evident truth in the Declaration of Independence that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In other words, God gave man his rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in the very next sentence, the founders defined the proper role of government when they stated that to secure these rights, governments are instituted. This is the entire philosophical base of our nation. Here, the government cannot legitimately redistribute the wealth, assume power over the people's lives, and dominate man's existence with oppressive taxation, regulations, and controls. According to the founders, government was to be a negative force, which leaves people alone. Its sole function is to protect citizens from one another and from foreign governments, and especially from their own government itself. The founders did not create a government to be a positive force, to do things for people, to take from some, to give to others. They understood that when a government starts doing something for one citizen, it has to take from another to do so. And in the process, it gains control over both. Britain's rulers didn't accept the Declaration of Independence, so our forefathers had to fight a war to make it stick. By 1783, the war for independence had been won, and British forces were sent back across the sea. But the governmental system at that time was weak. It had no power to settle disputes between the states, nor the power to tax for proper needs, such as national defense. So in 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states met in Philadelphia to revise the system, and they produced an entirely new governmental structure known as the Constitution of the United States. Keeping faith with the thunderous assertions in the Declaration, the Constitution was written to govern the government, not the people, and not the states, each of which was a jealous guardian of its own sovereignty. The founders created a central government with strictly limited powers. This left the states free to compete with one another to be the best state, the one with the least amount of taxation and controls, one where citizens would want to build a business and raise a family. That spirit of competition produced excellence, as honest competition always does. It's important to note that the Constitution wasn't forced on the people. It was sent back to the states for ratification, and several of the founding fathers wrote essays explaining it in an effort to persuade fellow Americans to adopt this new system of government. Some of the essays written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay were collected into a volume known as the Federalist Papers. Those essays provide valuable insights into the intent of the founders in establishing our government. Eventually, all 13 states ratified the Constitution, and then each ratified the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights, further tying the hands of the federal government. These amendments are indeed about rights, but it would have been better had the Bill of Rights been labeled the Bill of Limitations on Government. Why? Because it's vital to realize that the Bill of Rights never gave citizens any rights whatsoever. Its sole purpose was to safeguard God-given rights by limiting government power. The founders even insisted that Congress shall make no law about speech, religion, the press, assembly, the right to petition, the right to keep and bear arms, and so on. These amendments are directed squarely at the federal government, not the individual and not the states. They are like most of the 10 Commandments, which are essentially thou shalt nots. The Bill of Rights says Congress shall not, all the way up to the marvelous 10th Amendment, which says in effect, if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system. Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the far left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having zero power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found the type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these five, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practical sense. It's always a group that puts one of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists. Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history. And it is the most common form of government today. Most of the nations of the world are ruled by a powerful few, and therefore oligarchy remains. At the other end, we find anarchy, which means without government. Some people have looked over history and found that many of its worst crimes were committed by governments, so they decided that having no government might be a good idea. But this is a mistake, because as the ancient Greeks stated, without law there can be no freedom. Our founding fathers agreed and held that some amount of government is a necessary force in any civilized, orderly society. In a state of anarchy, however, everyone has to guard life, liberty, and property, and the lives of family members. Everyone must be armed, and movement is severely restricted because one's property has to be protected at all times. Civilized people have always hired someone to do the guarding, a sheriff, a police force, or some branch of government. Once law enforcement was in place, the people were freer. They could leave their property, work in the fields, and so on. In short, the proper amount of government makes everyone freer. There are some who advocate anarchy, however, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. They use anarchy as a tool for revolutionary change. The condition of anarchy is very much like a vacuum where something rushes in to fill it. These calculating anarchists work to break down the existing government with rioting, killing, looting, and terrorism. Tragically, the people living in such chaos often go to those best able to put an end to it and beg them to take over and restore order. And who is best able to put an end to the chaos? The very people who started it. The anarchists who created the problem then create a government run by them, an oligarchy, where they have total power. This is exactly what happened in Russia that led to Lenin taking total power, and in Germany, where Hitler's brown shirts created the chaos that brought him to power. But anarchy isn't a stable form of government. It's a quick transition from something that exists to something desired by the power-hungry. It's a temporary condition. And because it isn't permanent, we eliminate it as well. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratein, meaning to rule. Democracy, therefore, means the rule of the people, majority rule. This, of course, sounds good, but suppose the majority decides to take away one's home, or business, or children. Obviously, there has to be a limit. The flaw in democracy is that the majority isn't restrained. If more than half the people can be persuaded to want something in a democracy, they rule. What about republic? Well, that comes from the Latin, res meaning thing, and publica meaning public. It means the public thing, the law. A true republic is one where the government is limited by law, leaving the people alone. America's founders had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up an oligarchy. In fact, there were some who wanted George Washington to be their king. But the founding fathers knew history, and they chose to give us the rule of law in a republic, not the rule of a majority in a democracy. Why? Let's demonstrate the difference in the setting of the Old West. Consider a lynch mob in a democracy. 35 horseback riders chase one lone gunman. They catch him, and they vote 35-1 to hang him. Democracy has triumphed, and there's one less gunman to contend with. Now consider the same scenario in a republic. The 35 horseback riders catch the gunman and vote 35-1 to hang him, but the sheriff arrives, and he says, "You can't kill him. He's got his right to a fair trial." So they take the gunman back to town. A jury of his peers is selected, and they hear the evidence and the defense, and they decide if he shall hang. Does the jury even decide by majority rule? No, it has to be unanimous or he goes free. The rights of the government aren't subject to majority rule, but to the law. This is the essence of a republic. Many Americans would be surprised to learn that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution, nor does it appear in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. The founders did everything they could to keep us from having a democracy. James Madison, rightly known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in essay number 10 of the Federalist Papers, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." Alexander Hamilton agreed, and he stated, "We are a republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy." And John Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, stated, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." The founders had good reason to look upon democracy with contempt because they knew that the democracies in the early Greek city-states produced some of the wildest excesses of government imaginable. During that period in Greece, there was a man named Solon who urged creation of a fixed body of law not subject to majority whims. But where the Greeks never adopted Solon's wise counsel, the Romans did. Based on what they knew of Solon's laws, they created the 12 tables of the Roman law and, in effect, built a republic that limited government power and left the people alone. Since government was limited, the people were free to produce, with the understanding that they could keep the fruits of their labor. In time, Rome became wealthy and the envy of the world. In the midst of plenty, however, the Roman people forgot what freedom entailed. They forgot that the essence of freedom is the proper limitation of government. When government power grows, people freedom recedes. Once the Romans dropped their guard, power-seeking politicians began to exceed the powers granted them in the Roman Constitution. Some learned that they could elect politicians who would use government power to take property from some and give it to others. Agriculture subsidies were introduced, followed by housing and welfare programs. Inevitably, taxes rose and controls over the private sector were imposed. Soon, a number of Rome's producers could no longer make ends meet, and they went on the dole. Productivity declined, shortages developed, and mobs began roaming the streets, demanding bread and circuses from the government. Many were induced to trade freedom for security. Eventually, the whole system came crashing down. They went from a republic to a democracy and ended up with an oligarchy under a progression of the Caesars. Thus, democracy itself is not a stable form of government. Instead, it is the gradual transition from limited government to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. Knowing this, we as Americans are ultimately left with only two choices. We can keep our republic, as Franklin put it, or we will inevitably end up with an oligarchy, a tyranny of the elite. Just as there is widespread confusion regarding political systems, there is similar confusion in the economic arena. All during the 20th century, Americans were led to believe that there was a great struggle going on between capitalism and the communist world. Undoubtedly, a struggle existed, but the real adversaries were rarely identified properly. No discussion about economic systems will make sense without first defining terms. And one of the most basic terms in economics is capital, whose definition is the means of production. To illustrate what capital is, let's consider a very simple economy. On the sands of a small island, a castaway has just washed ashore. He has no food and he's hungry. He searches the island, he finds no berries, coconuts, or anything edible. He goes back into the water and tries to catch fish with his bare hands, but he fails. So he goes back up on shore and he finds a bush. He breaks off a branch, he gnaws at one end to make a sharp tip. Back into the water he goes, and with his spear, he catches fish. His spear is capital. It's the means of production for catching fish. He gave up some of his time and some of his energy to produce something he could not eat, but something that would help him to produce something that he could eat. Capital, therefore, can be tools, machinery, and even a man's handmade spear to catch fish. Such being the case, consider that the communists in the former Soviet Union, as well as in China and Cuba, have always used tools and machinery. Officials there even view people as capital. Therefore, by strict definition, are not communists capitalists? For that matter, isn't everyone a capitalist? And so, is not every economic system a capitalist system? What then is the difference between what the communist system is and what the American capitalist system is supposed to be? The difference is ownership of the capital. Is the system monopolistic, state-controlled capitalism, or is it competitive, free enterprise capitalism? It is between these two opposing economic systems that a battle has always raged. Before we proceed, let's also define free market. Basically, it's a self-regulating system in which all parties are completely free to transact with one another. But where force, fraud, or injury damages one party, the government's role is only to punish those who commit such offenses and to vindicate the rights of the other party. This protects the integrity of the free market, or free enterprise system, without intervening in it. The term private property also needs clarification, for private ownership and control of property is a key component in the free enterprise system. In order for ownership of property to be full and complete, all four of its aspects must be met. These are title, control, use, and the ability to dispose of what a person owns. In a free market economy, these aspects are unrestrained, so long as the owner does not infringe on the legitimate rights and claims of others. True ownership of property and freedom go hand in hand. They always have. Now let's compare the two systems of capitalism. In the competitive free enterprise system, capital or property is both owned privately and controlled privately. In the monopolistic system, holding title to capital can be accomplished privately or by the state. But more importantly, capital is controlled by the state or by the elite few who control the state. The Communist Manifesto, which contains the basic program for all communists and all socialists, explicitly preaches the destruction and abolition of private property. Karl Marx understood the powers of controlling capital, and so have all communists and socialists who have ever looked and still look to Marx as their leader. State-controlled capitalism results in high prices and low quality. After all, why would a monopoly strive to improve if it has no competition? On the other hand, honest, thrifty, and hardworking producers throughout the world prefer a competitive free enterprise system for all. Here, low prices and high quality prevail because a variety of producers will seek to attract the widest amount of customers. Competition results in excellence and always has. Just as the political spectrum shows the range of government power, we can also plot the various economic systems along another spectrum. These forms of government control in the market stand in sharp contrast with a completely free market. In the last century or so, there have been basically four forms of state-controlled economies, all on the far left of the economic spectrum: fascism, Nazism, socialism, and communism. In each, the government controls the capital. The difference among these is how much is owned or controlled outright by the government. In a fascist system, the government doesn't own businesses on paper, but it does control them. In Mussolini's Italy, even though he didn't hold title to businesses, he told the owners what to produce, how much to produce, when to produce, where to buy raw materials, who to hire, who to fire, and what price to charge. The rest, he said, was up to them. The fascist system is more efficient than other state control systems insofar as those living under it think they still own their businesses. Shopkeepers concern themselves with maintenance on the machinery, employee relations, painting the building, and so forth. But the government controls owners through an array of taxation and regulations. Under Nazism, which means National Socialism, its proponents went one step further and acquired ownership of some corporations such as Volkswagen. However, Hitler didn't seize ownership of other industrial giants. He simply controlled them, just as Mussolini had controlled businesses in Italy. Socialism is where government officials acquire possession of major industries such as transportation, communications, and utilities in order to leverage control over the entire economy. Through ownership of these vital segments of industry and by creating government regulatory agencies, socialists gain control over virtually everything else. Finally, there is communism, the granddaddy of all in the economic sense. In a way, communism is more honest than fascism because all of the capital is owned and controlled by the state. There are no pretenses about it. Now let's combine political and economic systems, because ultimately one never exists without the other. We see again that there are only two ultimate choices: a competitive free enterprise system in a republic, or a monopolistic state control system under an oligarchy. A moral people have always been a vital element of America's strength. The Founding Fathers well understood the biblical teaching that righteousness exalteth a nation. They also knew that expecting a free market economy and limited government under a republic to endure without morality was expecting the impossible. James Madison cautioned that limited government alone was inadequate for our nation. And John Adams observed, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." George Washington stated, "Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Yet there are people today who think that liberty is license and that morality is unimportant or irrelevant to politics and economics. But as Benjamin Franklin added, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. The alternative to Americanism is what has condemned most of the human race to live as slaves throughout the millennia. It is the idea that rights are privileges dispensed by an oligarchy according to the unlimited rule of men, that the state should control or own the nation's capital with all economic activity directed from a central power, and that morality is inconsequential, and that security is preferred over freedom and opportunity. Our nation continues to be steered off course, and the principles that led to America's greatness are being cast aside. The simple question for us is, do we continue to slide away from our nation's founding principles, or do we return to the kind of government we inherited? Time is running out for Americans who sense that something is wrong. They have to decide what kind of a country we shall leave for future generations. All that is needed is for a sufficient number of Americans to get involved in the fight for freedom and to return our nation to less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world.
Well, that's good, isn't it? Yeah, and the reason we show that video is because we believe that it covers in just a short amount of time, it's about a 30-minute video, all of the critical issues that it takes for us to understand what it is that we mean when we say that we're a republic and what it means when we talk about a capitalistic system. We want you to have access to that video. And so all you have to do is go to our website, libertypastors.com, and you can actually download that video and show that to Bible studies, to your church, to whatever. We would be honored for you to use it. It's really not ours. The John Birch Society is the one who actually put that video together, but we're able to use it. So please utilize that on the website.